and all hell broke loose. So all of a sudden, we're in the middle of informal and formal inquiries all over the place.
When I asked today's guest whether he'd be open to talking about some of the most challenging moments in his career, from facing ethical dilemmas to navigating failure to burning out, his answer was actually a resounding yes. Today's episode is a special one. I'm Tyler Finn, and today I have the pleasure of speaking with Mark Kahn, who's a partner at Protégé Search. Mark's had an incredible career, from working for a baseball team to being legal counsel for tech companies like Yahoo, Evernote, WhatsApp, and Twilio, and now he's an executive recruiter helping companies hire the right diverse exec-level talent, legal or otherwise. A common theme in his career trajectory seems to be change and perseverance. And for this episode, we're going to explore three core areas or moments of his life through this lens. Mark, we're really happy to have you here with us today. Thanks for agreeing to candidly discuss some difficult times in your career. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Tyler. Great to be here. Thank you for having me on and let me talk about, I guess, my favorite topic, which is me. I don't know. Anyways, that sounds a little weird, but whatever. It's good to be here and happy to go in any direction you want to take this conversation.
Before we start talking about WhatsApp and Segment and Twilio and all the places that you ended up working, Mark, I'd like to go back to the very beginning of your career when you were deciding to become a lawyer. Tell us a little bit about the why, what motivated you, and how you actually went about becoming a lawyer.
Yeah, so I graduated college in 1992, had a degree in computer science, wasn't really into hardcore programming. Like, there were people in my graduating class who would like go to the mainframe computers essentially and these high-powered workstations and like just code for fun all night, all weekend. That was not me. And so I decided, I went and got a job that used my computer science but was not sort of hardcore. And so I ended up working for this company that was, sort of like Ticketmaster. It was in the event ticketing space. But this was before internet ticketing or anything like that. As you would go to, music stores to buy your concert tickets and things like that. The Oakland A's ended up becoming a client of ours. And they were looking for somebody to help them, somebody who really knew the system inside and out to kind of help them run their season ticketing and all that. So I joined the Oakland A's to run the ticket operations. The president of the Oakland A's at the time was a guy named Sandy Alderson. Sandy was sort of an early mentor of mine. I remember a funny incident where he came into my office when the A's were talking about reacquiring Jose Canseco and was like, "We're thinking of bringing Canseco back. What would that do to ticket sales?" And I was like, "Oh God, how did I get here?" I was like, "I don't know, probably like 50,000 over the course of the season, something like the 50,000 tickets, maybe. I don't know. He's sort of a little washed at this point. It felt like, but he's still a big draw. I think it would help." Anyways, they ended up reacquiring Canseco. Anyways. Sandy was a mentor of mine, and he's a very smart, Harvard-trained lawyer. This is now sort of the mid-90s, 95, 96. The A's were not very good at that time. There had been an ownership change. And I was starting to think about, okay, is this it was sort of my dream to work in baseball. But what I found is like it was sort of like any other job, and actually one of the real downsides of it was like I was like not enjoying going to baseball games, and that really bothered me. So
like going to the office,
something like that. And so I started to think about, well, I never really expected to go back to school, but I started thinking about now you're starting to see some activity in tech. And I was like, well, what if I took this computer science degree and married it with a law degree? I think it would be really fun. And I think it could really add a lot of value to tech companies if I, sort of went in-house. Like ultimately, the goal was to go be a tech company lawyer, whatever that meant. I didn't know what that meant at the time. I just figured, hey, I could I understand technology. I versed in it. I figured there was something to be done there, but I wasn't sure exactly what. And so I ended up applying to
Mhm.
law school, and yeah, so 97, and then graduated in 2000.
And that played out for quite a while, right? You ended up making it in house and
Yeah, it was
had some success.
yeah, I started nosing around and repositioned myself as a litigator, even though I wanted to do tech trans, but I'm like, look, there's no tech trans market right now. I'm like, oh, I'm a clerk in a federal district court in Atlanta. We wanted to come back out here. That was always the plan. I'm a litigator. Yay. And so ended up going to this boutique litigation firm in San Francisco called Rogers Joseph O'Donnell. It was all of about 30 attorneys. Did like commercial litigation, government contracts, professional liability. We did a lot of like legal malpractice stuff.
Uh-huh.
A lot of ex big firm folks. A lot of folks who'd been at the old Pettit Martin firm, which is long since gone. And it was great. It was great. I mean, I really enjoyed being at that firm. It was good people. I'm still friends with a number of folks. The Alan Joseph, who was the Joseph and Rogers Joseph, he passed away a number of years ago, but he and I became very close. He came to my, like, actually the last place he was before he passed away of pancreatic cancer, the last like public event he was at was my son's bar mitzvah. So
Oh, wow.
it was a good place with good people, and I enjoyed it. But I kind of knew that not really what I wanted to be doing. And I got a reach out from an exec or a headhunter or a recruiter about going to a software company to basically go support their government contracts business. So I was doing a lot of government contract work, which was more of a DC practice. And so the company was Business Objects. So they were dual headquartered in San Jose and Paris. And so like they were looking for somebody to support the government business, ideally out here. And so like there weren't like I was a little bit of a unicorn in that respect. There weren't a lot of sort of, people around my graduation time out in California who knew government contracts. And so that's what I did. I joined Business Objects to support their government business, and then also did a lot of commercial licensing transactions there.
And you worked your way sort of up the in-house food chain from sort of one successive role to another. Tell us a little bit about that journey to, I think, what's going to be our first sort of break or topic, which is the time at WhatsApp.
Yeah. So the funny thing is about that Business Objects job, great company. Didn't really like the job at all. Like it was like rinse and repeat. Like how many times can I negotiate an indemnity? How many? And I didn't feel like I was very good at it. It was really my first bout with imposter syndrome, because I had been raised as a litigator. I had never had that sort of transactional training, and so the litigation background was helpful. But it's still like to this day I've never been super. Don't view myself. I don't think I'm a very good contract drafter. I think I think I have other lawyer skills which are much better and more advanced than that. But so I was actually on the verge of going back to my law firm, because I was not happy. And then this event happened. It was sort of happenstance, and I've had this happen a few times, where the general counsel had come from IBM, he had been at the company for all of 6 months, comes into my office and is like, or calls me down to his office more accurately, and says, "Hey, I need you to help out on a project." I'm like, "Okay." And you can't talk with anybody about it. Like, okay. So he's like, you have access to all the contracts that the company has, right? I'm like, yeah, because he knew I was working on this contract management. We were looking at contract management options, and I was, spearheading that project. And he says, "Well, we've been approached about an acquisition, and it looks like there's a reasonable chance it's going to go forward. You and I are the only members of the legal department that know about this." And keep in mind, this is not a tiny legal department. My boss, there were 2 layers between me and the GC, and neither my boss nor my boss's boss had any idea this was going on.
Oh, wow.
And so I spent the next month or so doing licensing deals by day and target side diligence by night. And this was like stocking a data room was not easy then, because there was a lot of like the stuff was in a number of different places, and just like the transferring and moving of documents and things like that was non-trivial. but the whole, I mean, that's was sort of the beginning of my involvement in the project and the whole, and it was, ended up like doing diligence meetings around legal stuff, and just like it ended up
Mhm.
exploding. And I was like, so, oh, like it's not in-house I don't like. It was like it's negotiating licensing deals that I don't like.
Yeah.
In-house is actually pretty cool. I just need to find the right opportunity. And about that time, not long after the acquisition happens, and I was like, well,
Mhm.
okay. And about that time, I got approached about a role. Basically, it was sort of like a product counsel type role at
Mhm.
Palm, which was the old, Trio handspring, Palm,
Of course.
smartphone, I guess. Before Apple had launched iPhone. And I got approached about basically coming over and supporting their engineering and product teams. I was like, oh, this is
Mhm.
interesting. And I had Palm devices. I was like, I thought it was a great, great company. And this was in the middle of their reinvention. And so I went over there for 2.5 years. Fun job. Company ultimately ran into a lot of issues, started to go down the
Sure.
toilet. About that time, there was an opportunity with Yahoo to support their mobile products. Well, now all of a sudden I have a lot of mobile experience. Went there.
Uh-huh.
That was where I realized that, okay, not even if I'm in an interesting role, like it's got to be the right size company for me. And I realized at Yahoo that I'm very much a startup guy. I
Yeah.
prefer startup environments. So from there, I became intentional about seeking out startup roles. I ended up being the second attorney at Evernote, and I get a call from Ann Hoagie. Ann was my boss at Yahoo. She had gone to
Mhm.
NetApp after that. And then after
Mhm.
NetApp, she had become the general counsel of WhatsApp. And she and I had been in touch, and I had been a reference for her when she joined WhatsApp. And she was 6 months into the job, and she's like, "Hey, I've been here for 6 months. They've told me I can hire somebody. You were my
Mhm.
first thought." And I'm like, "Let me think about it, Anne." And so I thought about it over the weekend, and I'm like, it feels pretty lateral to me. Like I was a
Yeah.
WhatsApp user actually, because from I just been in Beijing for Evernote, and I was familiar with the product and got what they were doing. I had no idea the scale and scope of sort of the reach of the product and the reach of the service. And so I said, "And I think I'm going to take a pass. Like really flattered,
Hmm.
happy to sort of help you identify some other folks. And here's a couple of folks you might consider talking to." And she's like, "Okay, yep, totally get it. That makes sense." A week later, I'm making these dates up, but it was not long after
Yeah.
the news comes out that WhatsApp is being acquired by Facebook. And
Oh.
so I think to myself, huh, that might not have been the opportunity to reject out of hand. And then I started rationalizing, well, like we wouldn't have gotten a deal done in a week. It was like way too
Yeah.
short. There's no way I would have been hired. The funny thing is like I am 99.9, actually I'm 100% certain. Like Anne had no idea that the deal was about to happen because that thing came together so quickly.
Mhm.
I think she was just like, I'm building the legal function here, and it just like the coincidental timing. About a month passes by, and Ann calls me back, and she's like, "Hey, Mark, I don't know if you heard, but about WhatsApp being acquired by Facebook. Um, I'm not sure. Does that change anything for you?" And I said, "I don't know, Ann. Does it?" And she's like, "Well, I think it might." And I'm like, "Okay, you've got my attention. Let's talk." And so one thing led to another. It took a while before it all came together, but I ended up joining WhatsApp in June of 2014. So the acquisition had gotten announced in February. I think it was President's Day. Oh, sorry, January. It was either President's Day or
Mhm.
MLK. Yeah, I think it was President's February. So it was President's Day
Mhm.
weekend. um, I joined in June. We didn't know when the acquisition was going to close because there were some antitrust challenges and other regulatory challenges, particularly in Europe. And ultimately, it closed in, I think it was October. And so, yeah, I kind of joined in the mid. The company was about 40 people when I joined, and yeah, so that's what got me to WhatsApp.
Tell us a little about what you expected it to be like going in, if you had any expectations at all, and then what it ended up being like working for what was still, a super hot but small company within the, I mean, behemoth, I guess you would sort of say, that is Facebook Meta. Yeah, tell us about what it
Yeah.
was like before and after.
I mean, it's that's a great question. It's sort of all a blur at this point. I think I don't know that I had specific expectations going into it, other than like I knew it was going to be a really dynamic environment in terms of like that was just going to be a lot of change. I would say candidly, I had some loose concerns that like at some point it might get too big, depending on like there was a commitment
Sure.
from Facebook from Facebook's leadership and to keep WhatsApp separate, and whatever separate means. Like it was clear, and they did live up to this. Like it was going to be, it wasn't just going to be immediately rolled up into Facebook, and be sort of like disappear altogether. And that's absolutely what happened. So I ended up being there for 3.5 years. Like we knew that the company was going to grow. We knew there was going to be a Facebook overlay to it. I don't think I had any idea sort of how, like I knew how that WhatsApp was much bigger internationally than it was in the US. I did not appreciate sort of how international my work was going to be. I mean, it's such an interesting environment. Like contract negotiations were not something we were really doing. Like we were doing like our version of contract negotiations. Basically, we would do these one sheet deals. I mean, they were full on contracts, but they were like one sheet deals with telcos for preloading WhatsApp onto their products around their phones around the world. And we had all the leverage. And so we would say, here are our terms, sign them. I'm sorry, we need to negotiate this. Okay, that's fine. We are now going to your number 2 because they will sign it. I guarantee. So we had all the leverage. So we weren't spending a lot of time negotiating contracts. What I was spending a lot of time doing, and I had no idea, didn't have any experience in this, was dealing with law enforcement and regulatory, not yet privacy, but like a lot of law enforcement and regulatory stuff, both in the US and around the world. But I mean, like the first time I got began to sort of appreciate what WhatsApp was like, because I did a trip to Brazil because Facebook had advised us, like, look, people in Brazil, the people in Brazil love WhatsApp. The government, not so much. The law enforcement, not so much. And you guys, WhatsApp, you have a reputation of being sort of standoffish, which was accurate. Like we're not really engaging with folks. We were focused on building the product and scaling the service and all of that. And so, Facebook was like, you really need to start engaging. Like, and we kind of begrudgingly did that. So I take a trip down to Brazil. I'm in Sao Paulo. I am at Facebook's outside council, and then we had our own council because we were still quite separate. This was post-close, but still, like, everybody thought it was important that we would have our own council down there. But I was meeting with Facebook's council, and I go into the building. It was a big high-rise, and I go to the receptionist, and I'm like, yeah, I'm here to see so and so with this law firm, and she's like, oh, okay, what company are you with? And I said, oh, I'm WhatsApp. And she's like, I don't know any Portuguese, but her English is pretty good. And she's like, no. What company are you at? It's like, WhatsApp. And she's like, one more time, And so finally I take out my business card and I hand it to her and say, WhatsApp. And like, you would have thought that like Mick Jagger or somebody, Beyonce walked in. She stares at me and like wide eyes. She's like, I was clear like this, like I was a rock star. It's like, no, I'm just a lawyer. It's not a big deal,
right.
But it was at that point, and like then you all of a sudden you're looking around Brazil, and it was like, WhatsApp is everywhere. Like in terms of it's on ads, like WhatsApp, and it was a verb there. It was pervasive. And Brazil was one of our largest installed user bases, and probably the most engaged if you look at like how many minutes people were on WhatsApp. So I was doing a lot of meetings trying to say, we're here. We want to talk with you. And we want to engage, and we want to be as helpful as we can. but they're like, well, you get questions like, we want the content of the messages so that we can track down the drug dealers, and we're like, yeah, we don't have that actually. We don't store that. And this was,
Hmm.
and then we launched end-to-end encryption, which totally like inflected it even more because the concerns of law enforcement, like there was no
For
access to
sure.
content anyways. But now we're launching encryption, and it was just like they were like people. I can't tell you how many times I heard some version of, you were doing this to thwart law enforcement. Like, no, we're actually not. We're doing this to promote to protect the privacy of users, and because there are a lot of people and there's a lot of autocracies around the world where having absolute confidence that your messages aren't being read by anybody is really important, and like life and death
Hmm.
important. And so but so I spent a lot of time like doing, I would say, public policy type work, both sort of before we had a formal, like Facebook was sort of advising us and we were talking to them about public policy.
Hmm.
We eventually had a policy team, that was not part of WhatsApp Legal, but this was sort of in the early days. So that's what I was spending a lot of my time doing. It was super interesting, pretty stressful at times, but like learn like
Yeah.
some like experience, like, well, how did I get here? I have no idea. So
Well, we'll come back to this when we get to your role at Twilio and some of the sort of questions that you and the team there grappled with. Um, in some ways, I think maybe you characterize time at WhatsApp as best of times in that sense. In some ways, worst of times in terms of the workload and burnout. And I think you're pretty open about this. Take us through, what was happening on kind of like the management side of the job, and what was going on, and how ultimately you decided to take a step back and take a sabbatical.
yeah. So I was there for 3.5 years. I would say the first 2.5 years were pretty like awesome, like career defining,
Yeah,
fascinating stuff. I testified before Brazilian Congress, like weird. Well, again, how
that's
did I get
pretty
here? Yeah.
amazing.
Yeah. Like I think my mom actually watched it. It was all in Portuguese. I had like a earbud translating in my ear, but like you could actually watch it online. It was sort of crazy. Um, the last year was rough. So it was probably around August of 2016. We are now at some point in this process around that same time, we moved on to Facebook's campus. We had been on our own campus in Mountain View. Now we're dropped on the Menlo Park campus, which was its own sort of
Mhm.
thing because we had our like Facebook and WhatsApp. I would tell people they're very similar in their mission. They want to connect the world. Um, Facebook does it through social networking. WhatsApp did it through
Mhm.
private secure messaging. It's roughly extroverts and introverts. WhatsApp was a very introverted, quiet culture. Facebook is not. And
That's
so it was a
really
bit of
interesting.
oil and water dropping us onto campus. So that was sort of in the atmosphere. Um, More substantively, we had announced in around August, changes to our privacy policy, which was going to allow some limited data sharing, not message content, because again we didn't have that, but metadata back with Facebook, the parent company, and all hell broke loose. Regulators
Mhm.
around the world got pretty upset, particularly in Europe, but also South America, other places. So all of a sudden, we're in the middle of informal and formal inquiries all over the place. And my team, there was some Facebook folks involved, Facebook legal folks involved, and WhatsApp legal folks involved because it
Mhm.
was both of us were sort of implicated. Obviously, it was a data sharing. And so my team at that point, I was leading the team that was sort of doing like law enforcement, product privacy. Um, and I forget, the team was not huge. We were like, I don't know, 4 or 5 people. And so here we are like writing briefs left and right. Um,
Mhm.
and I will say it was rough. It was rough procedurally, like the process of generating those and like the amount of reviews it had to go through. And here I was, like, again, I'm a startup lawyer and I'm not into process. And we're in like a very
Yeah.
heavy process. And then the other thing that's going on, probably more importantly, is like, I am not being an effective leader for my team. And what I mean by that is that like was very focused on getting the work done and less focused
Mhm.
on sort of building. It was a nascent team, like people, like it was all folks who had been there for a year or two at most, in some cases less. And like, I was very focused on getting the work done and less focused on sort of building the relationships and sort of really getting to know the folks on the team,
Mhm.
what they needed, what they wanted to work on, and as a result, I was not an effective leader. So much so that in early 2017, probably six
Mhm.
months after this happened, somewhere in that range, um, and made the decision to transition me back into a role, an individual contributor role, where I was, still working on interesting stuff to me, like more on the law enforcement stuff, engaging with regulators on like law
Right.
enforcement, trust and safety type issues, which I care deeply about, and then also thinking more about how to integrate law enforcement processes with Facebook and things, and
Mhm.
also how to evolve our law enforcement posture, I would say. Um, that stuff was interesting, but I very much felt sidelined, and so
Yeah.
I really just like I basically didn't take the transition well and continued to sort of, I would say, spiral down the hill. So much so that sort of by like my perform like I am struggling to do my to I'm struggling as an individual contributor,
Mhm.
having performance issues for the first time in my life, in my work life, first time I've ever had any performance issues, and sort of got to the point where like I was really stressed out, not sleeping at night, not succeeding in my job, not doing my job really, had become
Mhm.
toxic. I was like looking for anybody to blame. And I think I don't know for sure, but like my guess is I was probably weeks or maybe a month or two away from getting fired. And I was like, you know what?
Mhm.
I can't deal with this anymore, and decided to leave. It's a hard decision because I was leaving fairly significant amount of money on the table. But
Yeah.
I was really unhappy, and I felt like it was a question of not if I was going to leave, but when and on what terms. And like I
Mhm.
really didn't want to be walked out the door. Like I just didn't want that. And so I decided to leave. Um, I was in a fortunate position where I was like, I could leave without having something lined up. And then what I said to myself, okay, I'm going to take 3 to 6 months off. If it becomes a year, so be it. I don't even know if
Mhm.
I still want to be a lawyer. And so that was sort of like, I realized I kind of threw up on the screen there a little bit, but happy to sort of go down
Thank you for
further on
sharing
any
that
of
with us,
that.
Mark. Yeah.
In about January 2018, decided, okay, I still want to be a lawyer, but I want to go be the first lawyer someplace. I don't want to.
Mhm.
I want to go build a legal function from scratch. I don't want to go someplace that's had a lawyer before. I want to go where it's a
Mhm.
completely blank slate. And so I reached out to Craig Schmitz, who is he was our outside counsel at Evernote, and he was a corporate startup attorney at Goodwin. And I said, "Hey, Craig, I decided I still want to be a lawyer. Would love to grab lunch and like get your sense of what's out there." And he's like, yeah, let's grab lunch. In the meantime, you should look at Segment. And I said, "Oh, what the f is Segment? I've never heard of that." And I like, and so I looked. I was like, "Ah, oh, it's data. No, I've got data battle scars. I cannot do data." And he's like, "No, you should look at them. They've been looking for like a head of legal for a
Uh-huh.
while. Really good people. I think you should check it out." And I was like, "Fine." And so I literally did the interviews I went into the process for practice because I was like, part of me was like, oh, I got to figure out how I'm going to talk about the last year at WhatsApp and why
Sure.
I left and just sort of like the circumstances. And so I did it for practice, and um, I ended up really liking the people, and sort of the things I was focused on were people, product, and size. I really
Mhm.
had to like the people. I'm probably people one with an asterisk or one with a bullet. Uh, product. I thought it would be B2C because that's where I spent most of my career. But I realized during the process it was more about, does the product resonate with me? Because I've worked on B2C and B2B
Hmm.
products that don't resonate with me, and this product has to resonate with me. And then size, like I figured it would be like 100 people, 150. Segment was a little bigger, but that was really proxy for first lawyer.
Hmm.
And so I ended up um, ultimately getting really excited about it, and then took the job. A couple things happened before I accepted the job. One was I first thing that happened was Peter, the CEO of Segment, says to me, "Hey, I want you to talk to our head of recruiting." And I'm like, "I'm in no rush. I'll talk to whoever." He's like, so I get on the phone with this woman, Emily, who's now a good friend of mine. And she's like, "Hey, we're really excited about you. We think you would do awesome here.
Uh-huh.
We haven't made you an offer yet. And the reason for that is we feel like there's something holding you back. Do we have
Hmm.
that right?" And I'm like, this is not a conversation I've ever had before in this context at all, or anything close to
Yeah.
it. But I'm like, okay, let's have this conversation. So I said to her, I said, okay, like I think the company's great. The people are awesome. You've got this job scoped just right. It's a head of legal, not a GC. I don't care about the title. I really didn't, because I viewed it that would probably be my last legal job, and I don't care whether it's head of legal. Like the comp was more important to me. I was selfish in that way. Like, let's get the comp right. The title is what it is. Whatever.
Yeah.
I said, you got it scoped right. All of that. Here's the issue. It seems like what you really want is someone to come in and negotiate a lot of contracts. And this goes back to what I said before. It's like, I don't really enjoy doing that, and I'm not very good at it. And so if that's what you want, I'm probably not the right person. And she's like, "Yeah, got it. That's not what we want. Like, yes, you're going to come in, and the first 6 months, you are probably going to be involved negotiating a lot of contracts, because that's how you're going to get to know
Mhm.
the business. Uh, but within 6 months, we expect you to be out of that day to day, probably added somebody else to the team.
Mhm.
And you're now like moved on and focused on sort of other bigger structural issues and less of the triage." And I'm like, "Okay, got it. Yes, we can talk." And so from there, it kind of became got very serious very quickly. I ended up taking the job. A couple things we talked about. I talked with Peter about during this was the other thing I mentioned. One was like, look, I am perfectly comfortable with this being head of legal.
Mhm.
If you ultimately decide you need a GC, I want to be considered for it. You end up hiring somebody else, it's
Hmm.
obviously your prerogative.
Interesting.
Understand, I will probably leave if that happens. And I didn't say it in a threatening way. I was just like, I just want to be on
Yeah.
the same page. Like, I want to be in charge of the legal team. That's what I want. And he's like, "Yeah, yeah, got it. Let's talk about like what the path to GC looks like." I was like, "Yeah, that's great." So we had open conversations kind of all throughout until I ultimately got promoted to be GC. The other thing I talked with him about was, Peter, look, I had struggles in leadership when I was at WhatsApp.
Mhm.
Like, I'm sure I will make mistakes at Segment. I need them to be different mistakes. I feel like there's stuff I need to work through, and actions I need to take to ensure that I don't repeat the mistakes. I would love to work with an exec coach. And he's like, "Yeah, absolutely. Go find one that's good with lawyers. We'll absolutely pay for it. I've worked with 4 coaches myself." And
Wow.
so that was, yeah. And so when I took the job at Segment, not it was a few months down the road, because I was like, I gotta triage first. But like the back half, so I joined in March of 2018. I think like I ended up like this September, October was when I had hired somebody at that point, and I was able to, okay, now I need to work with an exec coach. And so that is one of the things that I did pretty early on.
How'd you find an exec coach? I just want to ask that because I hear that question, I get that question quite a bit from folks, and they don't always know where to turn or whether or not the one that they're reaching out to is the right one for them.
I have thoughts on that. And actually some stuff I'm working on, and we can talk about that later. Around like I'm doing some exec coaching stuff, looking like getting my own coaching certification, working with
Uh
some
huh.
folks at Berkeley. We can talk about that separately. I do think it's hard to find like the coach that I worked with. We didn't have great rapport, I got a
Hmm.
lot out of it, but it was like it's not somebody I would go work with again. Like I did get,
Yeah.
it allowed me to I really sort of process what had happened at WhatsApp and sort of how I was going and really develop some principles around how I was going to approach leadership at Segment as we were building the legal team. So I got a lot out of it, but it was not somebody who I was like, oh, this is like my lifelong, guru.
Okay, back to Segment. I think, as many people know, Segment was acquired by Twilio in a pretty blockbuster transaction, and you helped make that possible. What I'm really curious about is less for us to have a conversation about the acquisition, although another time folks should ask Mark for his thoughts on that, and more sort of what happened afterwards and how, unlike a lot of GCs who maybe are the GC at the acquired rather than the acquirer, you didn't take a step back and step away. You carved out a new role for yourself as their VP of ethical use. Super
Yeah.
interesting title. Tell us a little bit about the timeline there, and then I've got a few other questions about what some of the challenges you dealt with as their ethical use lead.
Yep. So the acquisition closed in November 2020. So right before, like literally a couple days before the election, a few days before the election. And my deal was I would stick around for 6 months and help with the transition. And uh, during that time, I had never met Karen Smith, who was Twilio's GC at the time. She and I became friends and still are very good friends to this day. We text and talk fairly regularly. But Karen and I started talking about some of my WhatsApp experience dealing with thorny trust and safety issues, and some of my Segment
Mhm.
experience, which I dealt with like policy issues around like public policy issues around federal privacy and stuff like that. And so Karen was asking me like, "What are you interested in?" I was sort of recounting some of the fun stuff I did at WhatsApp, the substantive fun stuff, and she's like, "That's really interesting." And she's like, "I've been sort of like charged with this ethical use construct that we have been, we've been sort of like fumbling around on here at Twilio, but it's basically the idea." So most companies, and Twilio included, have acceptable, and Segment included, have acceptable use policies. This is how
Mhm.
you can use our service. This is what you can do on our service. Ethical use was related, but a little different. It was more about who our customers were and how they use
Mhm.
our products and services, what they use it for, rather than the specifics of the data that might be going through the service.
And you brought up the interplay between sort of acceptable use policies and ethical use, and that figures pretty prominently in, maybe one of the most prominent cases that you dealt with and the whole team at Twilio dealt with, which was early after the acquisition had closed. Twilio goes to Parler, the right wing social media site app, and tells them that they're in violation of Twilio's acceptable use policy. Uh, take us through, and as a result, they're at risk of or are going to have access to Twilio services cut off. Take us back to that moment in time and how you were seeing it from your perspective, and to the extent that you can, how that decision was made.
Yeah. So yeah, this was all pretty public. So January 6th happens, and we learned, as everybody learned, like just through public, that Parler was
Mm-hmm.
a key component to the planning. We had reason to believe that Parler didn't really have much in the way of content moderation policies or practices in place. And so we basically reached out to them, sent them an email saying, and this is all public, saying, "Hey, we don't think you have content moderation policies or procedures in place. You have 72 hours to establish to us that we're wrong." and if you don't, we're going to terminate the service. Um, and they came back to us very quickly and said, yeah, we thought you might do this. We've migrated to a different service. And we're like, that's great. We're done. Awesome. Yeah, so it was it was very sort of like, this was all happening like in real time, January 6th, 7th, 8th. This was not weeks or months later. I think we sent the
Mhm.
email. It wasn't 6th, but it was the 7th or the 8th, at the latest. And so this all kind of was happening like as stuff was happening in DC. So it was pretty fascinating. It was hard though, right? Like, do you like
Mhm.
your like how you make these decisions and the process for doing it? Like, we didn't have, as even as I was stepping into the ethical use, we didn't have any of the framework that we would ultimately have. It still felt super ad hoc at that point. We had sort of
Mhm.
guiding principles, but that was about it.
Talk us through the development of that framework. And I think this is really interesting because on the one hand, you want principles or you want an approach, something that you can do sort of over and over again or to guide the internal discussion and debate. But a lot of these cases are pretty gray, not black and white. Talk us through the development of frameworks like this.
Yeah, I actually really like the process that we used for this, and it's not a process I came up with. I mean, the first thing I did was we brought in outside counsel, and not to shill for outside counsel, but we brought in Mark Zwillinger and Jake Summer at Zwilgen,
Uh-huh.
and they were like, if anybody has any tech policies, they are the folks, and so this was they were excited about this too because they had done some stuff around this, but nothing like what we were about to engage in. And so we had put together a steering committee of there were me and Karen and one other person from legal were involved, and then several business folks. And basically, we put together this committee with the idea that we were going to distill out some principles. And so then Mark, Jake, and I put together we gave everybody homework. We put together a dozen hypotheticals, each with multiple parts, to try and tease out, okay, where do folks think we should be drawing lines around, like who our customers were and the types of content and like what the process was going to be. And we knew that like the idea of these hypotheticals was not that everybody would have the same answers, but that we would
Sure.
have some, like we would hopefully have some set of situations where we're like, okay, everybody agrees this is what we would do, and some situations were on the opposite end, but there would be this sticky gray morass in the middle that would require sort of the hard conversations and the hard analysis. But it was never like the
Mhm.
thing about that. So there's this framework which was basically, it wasn't designed to it wasn't designed to be algorithmic in the sense that there wasn't going to be like you put in this set of factors and the answer spits out, and it's clear as day, and like that was not the goal of the framework. The goal of the framework was to ensure that we were applying the same lens to these
Mhm.
situations and we're consistently doing it, but with an acknowledgement that each case was going to be really gray, and it was going to be close calls, and people might not all come out the same way, even if they were applying the same framework, if that makes sense.
Uh-huh. It does. It's really interesting, impactful work, and ultimately you decided to step away from it and move into something that's totally different and doesn't require a law degree. And we're going to talk in just a minute about maybe demystifying a little bit of the executive recruiter role and how folks can work with those work with them. Mark has some tips there, but tell us about that decision to try something new. Was it scary? I mean, it's almost changing your identity a little bit.
um It wasn't scary. So the thought process on it was, so I was in this ethical use role for a better part of the year, and it was intellectually interesting,
Mm-hmm.
but I found myself not super engaged with it. And I haven't actually ever really sort of diagnosed that, except to say that it felt tangential. And as the GC of a startup, I was used to being in the middle of a lot of stuff. And this just felt like, okay, I'm doing this kind of like cute little side project over here, which, and then that was just, felt, it felt tangential. Um,
Huh.
Karen had announced earlier in the year that she was going to be leaving Twilio. And so I'm starting to
Mm-hmm.
think about, okay, do I want to stick in this role that I'm not super engaged in and really get to, and then a new, like, get to know and work with a new general counsel? That didn't feel super exciting to me. And so I started to think about what I wanted to do next. And one of the things that I'd gotten out of from working with the executive coach was that I really enjoyed working with folks on career stuff and helping them think about what they want to do with their careers. And so I started thinking about, like, oh, like exec search could be really interesting. I did, by the way, think about, well, would I want to go be a GC again?
Sure.
And I was like, I don't know. The segment ride was a pretty good one. Like, that's a good one to go out on. Number one, and number two, the like the notion of being a GC in a fully remote environment really didn't excite me. Like, I
Oh,
like being in the
interesting.
office. Like, like, if I
Yeah.
was a GC, I'd be perfectly comfortable with folks not being, like, wanting to be fully remote, perfectly comfortable, supportive of that. But for me personally, like, I want to be in the office like 2, 3, 4 days a week. And because that's where I would have some of the most interesting conversations.
Tell us a bit more about what it entails, and I guess what I'm really looking for almost is like demystify it a little bit for us. I think that a lot of folks who are either trying to get their first executive role or have had a number and maybe worked with exec recruiters in the past, they still don't have the whole puzzle put together on how to make that relationship the most effective that it can be. Talk us through any tips you have for folks who are job seeking.
Yeah. So exec search and legal search in general, like, that, we are retained search folks, and not every exec search or not every legal search does it this way, but most do. We are retained search. In other words, we are brought on by tech companies and other companies as an extension of them, and so
Mm-hmm.
we do searches on their behalf. What that means is that you talk to 5 different exec recruiters who are doing legal searches, you should get 5 different non-overlapping sets of opportunities that they are each working on. So that, my first piece of
Uh-huh.
advice is don't, like, you should not be marrying to one exec recruiter. You should be talking to a bunch of folks because you want to be on as many radars as possible. It is one thing. I mean, the other, and so kind of related to that, I get some confusion around this is that folks are like, they'll reach out to me, can you help me find a job? I was like, well, that's not what we do. Like, and
Right.
the shorthand we use is like, we find people for jobs, not jobs for people. Now,
Right.
there are headhunters out there who will go shop your resume. That's just not what we do, and that's not what most of the sort of well-known exec and legal recruiting firms do. They are retained and do it on their own. There are some who do contingent searches and where they don't have an exclusive on it. So there is a bit of a range of things. I don't mean to oversimplify things. I'm oversimplifying things too much, but I think just recognizing that being on the radar of as many folks as possible is a good idea. I think the other thing that I would say right now is like, it's a tough market out there for in
Mm-hmm.
tech, and legal, lawyers in tech as well. It remains a tough market. It's gotten better. Um, but a lot of companies are going it on their own right now when they're hiring, especially for like non-GC roles, but even GC roles, they're going out on their own
Sure.
and not engaging an exec search firm because they're like, oh, I've got all these recruiters sitting around not doing anything. Like, why would I go pay an external firm a commission when I've got salaried folks here who are under underemployed right now, and so let's put them to work. So doesn't mean you shouldn't be talking to exec recruiters, but just understand that there are jobs being filled without any involvement of exec recruiters.
As we start to wrap up, a couple of shorter, hopefully easier questions for you. Any book that you'd recommend folks read, whether about career or otherwise?
It's a great question. I meant to bring this up before, but I'm not big on self-help books. But when I really am not. But when during the sort of post WhatsApp sabbatical, I was down at a program at Stanford where I did my undergrad, and the president of the university was talking about like, oh, the most popular class with undergrads these days is a class taught out of our design school. It's called Designing Your Life. And it's
I've heard of
basically,
this.
yeah. So it's interesting. It's basically like the premise of it is like, everybody tells you to follow your passion, but unless you're like an artist or an athlete or something like that, it's really hard, particularly for lawyers, to actualize. And so this comes at it from a different way, a different place, which is, let's help you figure out what you want your life to look like. How does work fit in? How does family, travel, hobbies, nonprofit, philanthropic community, like how does it all fit together? And so it's an active read. It's an easy read. I didn't take, like, you could take a class on designing your life, but so these are two design school professors at Stanford who wrote this book and teach this class. Like, I never took the class. The book is like $15 on, Amazon or whatever. And I highly recommend it. I've sent a lot of people to it. I do think, particularly as you're trying to figure out, like, what do you want to be doing? I found it to be a very useful read.
Maybe a little bit in the same vein, a last question for you, which is if you can go back to before you went in-house, maybe even before you joined the firm or very early on, any advice that you'd have for your younger self?
I don't know if it's advice per se, but I wish I could have prepared myself for, like, I wish I'd been better prepared for the challenges that I saw at WhatsApp. Like, in terms of like the challenges, like that like challenges with getting my job done and doing my job. I wish I had known that that those were going to happen and that I would get through it. And that I wouldn't actually end up spending a fair bit of time, like, thereafter, like, really sort of questioning whether I was a good lawyer or not, like all of that, like the sort of imposter syndrome. And I just wish I had known that, like, that there was going to be a path forward. That is so unrealistic, because people will tell you that, but until you're sort of in the middle of it, you don't know how it, until you've experienced it, you really can't anticipate what it's going to be like.
Sure. Well, I hope that some of the folks who are listening to this, maybe if they're at a moment like that in their careers, they can learn from your experience and know that it is possible to come out the other side and actually have an even better experience or more career defining experience afterwards. Mark, thank you so much for joining us on The Abstract. Any final thoughts you'd like to share with folks?
No, just thank you, Tyler, and thank you, Spotrat, for doing this. I do think it's a very high value thing, and I think it allows, it gives folks exposure. Folks who are listening and watching, it gives an exposure to folks who have seen other things in the legal profession, and so I think it's a great service. So thank you.
It's the best part of my job, the thing that I like the most. Thanks to all of our listeners, too, for listening to this episode of The Abstract. Hope to see you next time. Thanks for tuning in today. Don't forget to subscribe so you can get notified as soon as we post a new episode. And if you liked this one, I'd really love to hear your thoughts. So please leave a rating or a comment. If you'd like to reach out to me or our guest, our LinkedIn profiles are in the description. See you all next week.